Today we talk about the metaphysics of theism. The second fundamental issue of metatheology that I want to argue in favor of concerns whether or not God is a personal being. There are views about the nature of God that take God not to be a person. Pantheism, for example, identifies God with the universe as a whole. God just is everything that there is, the sum total of everything. Well, I don't know about you, but I'm not inclined to view the universe as a person. There are ways to think about the universe as a kind of person, but that tends to be classified as a version of panentheism rather than pantheism. We'll talk more about the difference between those two views later in the course, but pantheism is best thought of as making an identity claim about the relation between God and the universe. Panentheism is a bit more complicated and depends on who you're talking to, who claims to be a panentheist, exactly what the view is. But at least it appears panentheism is committed to the view that the universe as a whole is something like God's body. And then God would be something not to be identified with God's body, but rather something over and above God's body or something distinct from God's body, perhaps in the way that human beings are supposed to be something over and above their own bodies. You have a body, you are an embodied being, but perhaps you're not identical to your body. So maybe God's like that with respect to the universe. There is a worry about attributing personhood to God, and that worry is anthropomorphism. Anthropomorphism arises when you take properties of things that you find in your ordinary experience of the world, and because you think they're pretty good qualities, you attribute them to God. So among the most impressive individuals in the universe you run into are persons. Persons look to be superior to rocks. They're at least more impressive than rocks in some important ways. Maybe they're more impressive than trees, though sequoia trees are kind of cool. But whatever you say, well, being a person, that's kind of a neat thing, so I guess God's a person. Here's Xenophanes. Xenophanes on whether or not God is a person and what you should be careful saying about God. Here's the quote: "But if horses or oxen or lions had hands or could draw with their hands and accomplish such works as man, horses would draw the figures of the gods as similar to horses, and the oxen as similar to oxen." This is in fragment 15, in case you want to know. I don't know how the numbering system was made, but in any case, it's fragment 15. Now, the idea is, look, if horses or oxen could do a bit of theology, God would be horse-like, or God would be like an ox. And this worry never goes away from the history of theology. There's always the worry that what we're doing is projecting features of human beings or things that we like onto God. So anthropomorphism says the anthrop part is about human beings. So you look around, what's the most impressive human being qualities you can recognize? That's what God's going to be like. So you have to be very careful in trying to establish any presumption that God is a person. So let's do that. Let's be as careful as we can. What is the argument that there's a presumption in favor of approaches to theology that can sustain the conclusion that God is to be thought of as a person? I think it goes like this. So suppose you're thinking God is responsible for everything. That's the kind of thing that creator theologians focus on. God is the creator and sustainer of everything. So you look around the universe and you notice it has certain precise characteristics. It doesn't matter what you're focusing on. It could be the nature of an oak tree. It could be any part of natural science. It doesn't matter what you've got. You've got very specific effects that are in place. And theologically inclined people trace these precise effects to the activity of God. Well, you've got two choices here. One is, well, is God a person or is God not a person? Suppose God isn't a person. There's still the power element. I mean, there are things that exert power that aren't persons. Nothing is surprising about that. So there's no obvious reason why an impersonal force couldn't be responsible for the precise arrangement of things that we observe around us. But the question is, how is the impersonal force constituted to yield the precise effects that we observe? Notice in other cases where impersonal items generate effects. For example, just take classic physics and talk about billiard balls and that sort of thing. So the cue ball is moving and it strikes the 8 ball, and the 8 ball takes a very specific angle and heads away from the cue ball at a very specific speed. What is it about the cue ball that generates that very precise outcome? Well, the answer is it's the very precise speed, momentum, angle, velocity of the cue ball that does the explanatory work here. Now, there's also laws of nature that are involved, but you have to have a very specific arrangement of, but you need a very specific array of features connected to the nature of the cue ball to explain the precise effect you observe in the movement of the 8 ball. So suppose God is an impersonal force. What is it about the nature of God? What is it in the nature of the force in question that generates the precise outcome that we observe? So here's one really uninformative way to proceed. Look up the word, if you don't know it already, soporific. So you have a substance in front of you. And when you ingest it, it puts you to sleep. What is the precise arrangement of features in that substance that makes it put you to sleep when you ingest it? An uninformative, unhelpful characterization is, well, it's soporific features. It's the sleep-inducing features of the substance in question. So you can do the same sort of trivial, uninformative linking of the impersonal force, which is God, with the specific outcomes that we observe by saying, well, we don't really know anything about the divine nature. All we know is the impersonal force is arranged in precisely the right way to generate those precise outcomes. That's not any sort of explanation that gives us insight or understanding. On the other hand, if you attribute personhood to God, You are now thinking about God as an agent. For present purposes, all we need to do is attribute to God the aspects of agency that involve having a will and an intellect. As soon as you have those two things, and you look at the precise outcome, and you ask, what is it about the activity of God that generates this precise outcome? Now you have a story to tell. You can say, well, what happens when God does something is that God has certain intentions, and his will is structured in a certain way, and his intellect is structured in a certain way. And as a result of the precise character of intellect and will in the divine nature, we get the precise outcome that we observe. So think about a simple case of basic action in your own case. Action theory began in, say, the 1950s, maybe a little bit earlier, with a thought experiment by Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein said, what's the difference between my arm going up and my raising my arm? So in both cases, the arm goes up. But your arm can go up without you raising your arm. Maybe you just have a spasm. A muscular spasm can make the arm go up. Maybe somebody else grabbed your arm and made it go up. Your raising your arm is different in some respect from that. So let's think about you raising your arm or you trying to raise your arm. What is it that makes a certain activity on the part of a human being a trying to raise an arm? A natural story to tell is to appeal to mental states. You tried to raise your arm, and what generated that trying was some sort of mental state or states that you're in. Your intention to raise your arm, your understanding of what it takes to try to raise your arm, your preference that your arm goes up, whatever it is, you've got intentional elements, stuff that's mental in nature, and the mental states in question have a particular precise content. And the trying is the result of being in those mental states. It is the fine-grained nature of the content of the mental states that explains the precise outcome that we observe. So you can say the same thing about God. It is the precise, fine-grained contents of the divine attitudes, intentions, will, cognitions that yield the precise outcomes that we have. This is not just an appeal to a power we know not what, we know nothing about. This is an explanation that yields some insight or understanding. So if you have personhood in God, you have a basis for insight into how God could be the cause of specific outcomes that we observe around us. Now, I don't mean that to sound like a definitive argument. It is a presumption in favor of the idea that God is a person. There could be problems that arise with the story that I just gave. There could be ways around it. You could sustain an impersonal conception of God by pursuing responses to this argument and explanations of a different sort for how you connect God's features with the precise outcomes that we observe around us. But in the absence of further investigation, this second issue is like the first, the monotheism case. Both of them create a presumption in favor of the idea that God is one and a person. The cases are not definitive, so it's possible to resist them, but in the absence of further information, we should find flawed views that can't sustain monotheism and the personhood of God.